Yul Brynner stood in the sweltering December heat of Hoa Air Base, watching Bob Hope command an audience of 3,000 battle-weary soldiers with nothing but a microphone and the kind of fearless joy that only came from understanding exactly how much these men needed to laugh. Vietnam, December 1965, 92 degrees at sunset, and two very different kinds of courage were about to recognize each other. If you're fascinated by untold stories of Yul Brynner's legendary encounters with America's greatest entertainers in the world's most dangerous places, subscribe to Yul Brynner Untold Legacy for more hidden moments where different forms of heroism met in extraordinary circumstances. The 45-year-old Brynner had arrived at Bien Hoa that morning as a United Nations special envoy, investigating the growing refugee crisis that was tearing South Vietnam apart. He had spent the day in camps outside Saigon, documenting stories of families torn apart by war, children orphaned by violence, elderly people displaced from villages they had never left before. His black clothes were dust-covered, his face grim from witnessing suffering that no camera would ever capture. Now he stood at the edge of the makeshift amphitheater, watching 62-year-old Bob Hope work magic with an audience that had seen too much death and not enough hope. Hope's Christmas show had been running for 90 minutes, and despite the oppressive heat, the constant threat of enemy fire, and the bone-deep exhaustion that marked every face in the crowd, the soldiers were laughing. So I asked General Westmoreland how the war was going. Hope was saying into the microphone, his timing as precise as artillery. He said, "Great, we're winning every battle." I said, "Then why am I here?" He said, "Because we're running out of battles." The laughter that erupted was more than amusement. It was release, catharsis, a moment when 3,000 men who had been carrying impossible burdens were allowed to set them down and remember what it felt like to be young and alive and hopeful. Yul watched Hope work with growing admiration. This wasn't just entertainment. This was therapy administered by a master who understood that sometimes the difference between despair and endurance was a perfectly timed joke, delivered by someone brave enough to fly into a war zone just to remind soldiers that the world still contained laughter. That's when the incoming fire began. The first mortar round landed 50 yards from the stage, close enough to shower the back rows with dirt and debris. Soldiers instinctively hit the deck, weapons appearing from nowhere as training kicked in and transformed laughing audience members into combat-ready infantry. Bob Hope never moved. He stood at the microphone, watching calmly as chaos erupted around him, and when the dust settled enough for him to be heard, he leaned into the microphone and said, "Well, that's one way to get applause. Though I have to say, Charlie's timing is terrible. I hadn't even gotten to the good material yet." The second round landed closer, and this time even the stage shook. Hope grabbed the microphone stand to steady himself but never stopped talking. "You know, back in Hollywood, when an audience doesn't like your act, they just walk out. Here they shoot at you. I've got to say, I prefer the walking." Incredibly, impossibly, the soldiers began to laugh again. Not the forced laughter of men trying to be brave, but genuine amusement at the absurdity of a comedian refusing to be intimidated by enemy fire. "Don't worry, boys," Hope continued as military police moved through the crowd, organizing an orderly withdrawal to bunkers. "I've been bombing on stage for 40 years. This is the first time the bombing was literal." Yul Brynner watched in fascination as Hope single-handedly prevented a panic. The comedian's absolute refusal to show fear gave 3,000 soldiers permission to remain calm, to move in good order, to maintain dignity even in the face of incoming artillery. The evacuation took 12 minutes. Hope kept talking through all of it, cracking jokes, making observations, treating the entire experience like an unplanned part of the show. When the last soldier had reached safety and the stage area was declared clear, Hope finally set down his microphone and walked calmly toward the bunkers. That's where Yul intercepted him. "Mr. Hope," Yul said, stepping out of the shadows where he had been observing the entire performance. "A moment, if you please." Hope turned, recognizing the distinctive accent and imposing presence immediately. "Yul Brynner, what in the world are you doing in this god-forsaken place?" United Nations business, Yul replied simply. Refugee documentation. And you? Besides demonstrating the most remarkable display of courage under fire I have witnessed outside of actual combat. Hope's public persona flickered for just a moment, revealing something deeper and more complex underneath. Just trying to remind the boys that there's still something worth fighting for back home, something worth surviving for. They walked together toward the relative safety of the communications bunker, the sound of distant artillery providing an ominous soundtrack to their conversation. Around them, soldiers moved with the efficient calm of men who had learned to live with danger, but Yul noticed how many of them nodded respectfully to Hope as he passed. "May I ask you something?" Yul said when they reached the bunker entrance. "Shoot, metaphorically speaking. What I witnessed tonight, that was not entertainment. That was leadership. Command presence. You controlled 3,000 men in a crisis situation using nothing but words and absolute fearlessness. How does a comedian learn to do that?" Hope was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. When he answered, his voice had lost its characteristic lightness. "Same way anyone learns anything important, I suppose. By paying attention to what matters and caring more about other people than you do about yourself." They descended into the bunker, where dozens of soldiers were waiting out the artillery barrage. The space was cramped, hot, and filled with the controlled tension of men who had no choice but to endure whatever came next. Hope immediately began moving among them, checking on wounded men, sharing quiet words with those who looked most rattled by the evening's events. Yul watched this private performance with growing respect. Away from the microphones and cameras, Hope was still working, still using his presence to reassure, comfort, and inspire. But now it was personal, individual, tailored to each soldier's specific need. "Bobby," one young private called out, using the familiar name that Hope encouraged among the troops. "Think they'll let us finish the show tomorrow?" "Count on it, son," Hope replied without hesitation. "I didn't fly 8,000 miles to leave you boys hanging. Besides, I've got some new material about incoming fire that I'm dying to try out." The laughter that followed was quieter, but no less genuine than what had erupted on the stage. These men trusted Hope completely, not because he was funny, but because he was there, voluntarily, repeatedly, sharing their danger and refusing to treat them as anything less than heroes worthy of the best entertainment America could provide. After an hour, the all clear sounded, and soldiers began filing out of the bunker. Hope lingered, saying personal goodbyes, promising to pass messages to families back home, making sure everyone knew they had been seen and valued as individuals. When the bunker was finally empty except for the two of them, Yul approached Hope with something like reverence. "Bob," he said, using the familiar name for the first time, "I need to tell you something. I spent today documenting human suffering on a scale that defies description. Refugee camps filled with people who have lost everything. Children who have forgotten how to smile. Families torn apart by forces beyond their control." Hope nodded, his expression serious. "I've seen the camps. It's hard to find words for what this war is costing." "Yes," Yul agreed, "it is. But tonight, I watched you give 3,000 men something I had begun to think might not exist anymore in this place." "What's that?" "Hope," Yul said simply. "The thing you're named for. The thing they need more than food or ammunition or reinforcements. The belief that tomorrow might be better than today." Hope was quiet, processing the weight of the observation. "I spend my career playing kings," Yul continued, "wearing crowns, commanding respect through costume and script and the magic of cinema. But you stand on a stage under enemy fire and command an army with nothing but words and absolute courage. You are more of a king than any character I have ever portrayed." "No, let me finish. What I witnessed tonight was not comedy, it was command, leadership of the highest order. You took 3,000 men who were facing death every day and reminded them why life was worth living. That is not entertainment. That is salvation." Hope extended his hand, and Yul grasped it firmly, The handshake lasted longer than social convention required, a moment of mutual recognition between two men who had chosen to use their fame in service of something larger than themselves. "You know what the real joke is?" Hope said finally. "Back home, they think I'm just a comedian who tells jokes to soldiers. They have no idea what these boys are going through, what they're sacrificing, what they need from us. And what do they need? To know they're not forgotten. To know their sacrifice matters. To know that somewhere, people still believe in the things they're fighting for." Hope paused, and sometimes just to laugh, to remember what it felt like to be young and stupid and happy. Yul nodded slowly. "And you provide all of that?" "I try. Some days I succeed, some days I don't. But I keep showing up because they keep showing up. Seems like the least I can do." They emerged from the bunker together, walking out into the humid Vietnam night. The base had returned to normal operations, sentries at their posts, aircraft being prepped for morning missions, the endless routine of a military installation at war. "Will you be staying long?" Hope asked. "A few more days. I have reports to write, recommendations to make. The refugee situation is going to get worse before it gets better." "And then back to Hollywood?" "Eventually. But this changes things, changes how I think about the work, about what matters." Yul looked around the base, taking in the controlled chaos of men preparing for another day of war. It's hard to care about box office receipts after you've seen what real courage looks like. Hope nodded understanding. "Gets to you, doesn't it? These boys. What they're going through. What they're willing to do." "Yes, it does." They reached the guest quarters where both men would spend the night. Hope preparing for another show. Yul preparing for another day in refugee camps that would break most people's hearts. "Why, Yul?" Hope said as they prepared to part ways. "Thanks for what you said back there, about leadership, about what this work means. Sometimes you wonder if any of it makes a difference." "It does," Yul replied with absolute certainty. "What you did tonight, preventing panic, maintaining morale, giving those men something to hold on to that saved lives. Maybe not in the dramatic way that combat medics save lives, but just as surely. Men who can still laugh, can still hope. Men who can still hope, can still fight. Men who can still fight, can still come home." Hope smiled, and for the first time that evening the smile reached his eyes. "When you put it like that, it almost sounds important." "It is the most important thing in the world," Yul said seriously, "and you are very, very good at it." Years later, Bob Hope would describe that night in Vietnam as one of the most meaningful encounters of his career. In a 1985 interview, he said, "You meet a lot of people in this business, but Yul Brynner was something special. He understood what we were trying to do over there, why it mattered. Coming from someone like him, someone who had real gravitas, real depth, that meant everything." The interviewer asked what had impressed him most about Brynner. "His seriousness," Hope replied without hesitation. "Not grim seriousness, but the kind that comes from understanding what really matters. He'd spent the day with refugees, seen the worst of what war does to innocent people. But he also recognized what entertainment could do for soldiers who were carrying impossible burdens. He got it, the whole picture." Yul Brynner, in a rare interview about his humanitarian work, was asked about his most memorable encounter during his UN missions. "Bob Hope at Bien Hoa," he said immediately. "I expected to meet a comedian. Instead, I met a general who happened to use humor as his weapon of choice." What he accomplished that night, maintaining morale under fire, preventing panic, giving hope to men who had every reason to despair, that was leadership of the highest order. The interviewer pressed for details about Hope's performance under enemy fire. "Extraordinary," Yul said simply. "I have seen men face death in many circumstances. I have rarely seen anyone face it with such grace, such purpose, such absolute commitment to serving others. He could have taken cover, he could have ended the show. Instead, he chose to stand there and remind 3,000 soldiers that courage could take many forms, including the courage to laugh in the face of mortal danger." This story reminds us that heroism comes in many forms, and the most powerful kind often operates without recognition or reward. Bob Hope's Christmas shows in Vietnam weren't just entertainment. They were acts of psychological warfare against despair, carefully calibrated missions to maintain morale and preserve humanity in circumstances designed to destroy both. Yul Brynner's recognition of Hope's true contribution revealed his own understanding of leadership and service. Having spent his career portraying kings and commanders, he recognized authentic authority when he saw it, even when it came disguised as comedy. The encounter between these two men in that steamy Vietnam bunker represented more than mutual admiration between celebrities. It was a moment when different forms of courage recognized and honored each other, when the entertainer and the humanitarian understood that they were fighting the same battle against human suffering using different weapons. In a war where so much seemed senseless, their meeting reminded both men that some things, laughter, hope, the refusal to surrender humanity even in inhuman circumstances, were worth preserving at any cost. If this story of two different kinds of courage meeting in extraordinary circumstances resonated with you, Yul Brynner Untold Legacy preserves exactly these kinds of encounters. The moments when Yul Brynner's deep understanding of human struggle intersected with others who had dedicated their lives to serving something larger than themselves. His recognition of Bob Hope's true contribution to the war effort revealed both his own character and his understanding that heroism takes many forms, some of which history barely remembers, despite their profound impact on those who needed them most. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to discover more stories where authentic greatness revealed itself in the most unlikely circumstances, where famous names proved their worth through service rather than self-promotion, and where the measure of a man's character was taken not by his success, but by his willingness to share danger with those who had no choice but to face it. Because some lessons about courage, service, and the power of hope can only be learned from those who've proven their worth when it mattered most.